There was a knock on my door a couple years ago during election season, and I answered the door, and usually I hate talking to people who knock on my door about the election or whatever else they might be coming for. But this time I recognized immediately the person knocked on my door was Pamela Price, who was running to be the Alameda County District Attorney, and I was excited to talk to Pamela Price. She said, "Hi, I'm Pamela Price." I said, "I know." I was excited to talk to Pamela Price because she was bringing a vision for what justice could really look like in our society to the district attorney's office, a place of real power to enact that vision. And I was excited about it. And one of the great tragedies of our local elections this past November is that she was recalled from that office. I don't think recalls are generally a good idea, and I especially didn't think it was a good idea to recall her. But we got to talking that day on my front porch about what she was planning to do with that district attorney's office that had for so long held such a different shape than the one she imagined for it. I said, "You've got your work cut out for her." And she said, "I know, but I've got this. I know how to run an office." I said, "Okay." And she took another moment with me, and the thing I remember her saying after she found out I was a minister, I think it was, she said, "You know, these people, they don't know what justice is. These people running our justice system, they've forgotten what justice is. They don't know what justice is." When the fabric of society is so far from the vision of justice that we try and remember each week when we listen to sacred texts or contemporary poems or sing old songs and tell old stories, when we try and rekindle in our living memory that vision of justice that has been held and passed down by people through generations, we know that its creation sometimes does require heat. Have you heard of the Big Blow-Up? Do you know the story of the Big Blow-Up? It was 1910, and it was the biggest forest fire that has ever burned in the United States of America. I think it was 3 million acres that burned, Idaho and Montana into Washington, all the way up to British Columbia. The Big Blow-Up. The U.S. Forest Service, I think it was the National Forest Service then, had just been created under the leadership of that wild, reckless conservationist, Teddy Roosevelt. And the U.S. Forest Service, in response to the Big Blow-Up, 3 million acres burning, was able to get the nation to back it with more and more funding. I think their funding doubled from one year to the next and continued to increase year over year as they took on their mission of suppressing all forest fires. It didn't work. By the 1960s or 70s, ecologists had proven that it was a necessity to allow forest fires to burn for the health of the ecosystem, that if there was too much fire suppression, that would actually create a bigger blow-up to come. So there's a dynamic here. There's the cooling and the heating. There's a dynamic process of how we engage in the work of justice making that has to do with tending to when things are too cold or when things are too hot. And I do think about that image of the glass blower. I think about the glass blower who heats the glass up. Is it to 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit, Peter? It's just this molten hot glass, and then cools it down to just a mild 2,000 degrees in order to start to shape it. And if you've ever watched a glass blower at work, you've seen that dance, right, of the coming in and the coming out, the pushing into the crucible to heat up, the coming out to let it cool down, all the while moving, spinning. And what's required the entire time is that the glass blower hold that vision in their mind of the vessel that they are attempting to shape. The vision that will guide their dance in and out of the crucible, their dance of moving that glass along its point on the end of I don't know what the stick is called. I'm sure Peter could tell us. When that glass moves, it's moving in response to a vision firmly held by the artist. So the artist has to know what it is that vessel's going to look like. But we're caught in this place where so many who are ostensibly responsible for our justice system don't know what justice is. When we have a school-to-prison pipeline that thinks it's a good idea to lock up teenagers, and some of them send them to prison for the rest of their lives, they don't know what justice is. When we blame fires raging through people's homes on diversity, equity, and inclusion, we don't know what justice is. The nominee for the Attorney General, ostensibly the highest ranking justice official in the land, can't say that they would hold their loyalty to the Constitution over their loyalty to the president when those things come in conflict. I don't know what justice is. And it's why King's legacy endures the way it endures. And there's so much to say about that incredible man. There's so much to say about his theological gifts, about the ways that he organized for a vision much more radical than we usually give him credit for. But there's something to that elementary school version of Dr. King as well. The Dr. King who is so notably whitewashed and remembered in I Have a Dream. Because what King did and what outlasted the shattering of his life was a clear articulation of a vision of justice. It's what he did in that most famous speech. It's what he did over and over again as he inspired people to action, was hold before us a clear vision of what justice is. And he said, and it's one of those phrases that when you think about it too much, it starts giving you trouble. So I wanted to just bring it back up in front of us. He said, because it gives us hope, but maybe a demanding, hard hope in a moment like tomorrow, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It can feel so out of key, so painful to the ears in a moment that is so dissonant with that vision of justice. And yet when he spoke those words, he was speaking them to people who knew in their bones and in their bodies that those moments of shattering had come, were coming, would come again, that their lives and their bodies would be at risk if they were to continue pursuing that justice-shaped bend. People who knew their dreams had been shattered, who knew that risk after risk was the only path that justice-shaped bend could take to reach its destination. King was, when he said that, quoting, I think, and making more eloquent, the words of an obscure 19th century Unitarian preacher, Theodore Parker. This transcendentalist firebrand, Theodore Parker, was in that crowd with Emerson and Thoreau and so on. He knew some suffering in his life. He grew up and lost 7 siblings and both of his parents to tuberculosis. He became an avid abolitionist in the years after the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, up until the Dred Scott decision and the Civil War. He was fighting for the freedom of people who had escaped slavery and made it to New England, where he preached. Now, the story we like to tell about Theodore Parker is that he had a pistol in his pulpit. He would preach with a pistol in his pulpit in order to scare off and maybe even take that shattering risk of firing it at slave catchers who might dare to come into his congregation and try and capture people who had escaped from slavery who were worshiping with him. This is the kind of risk-taking he was willing to do. The story we don't like to tell about Theodore Parker is that the Unitarian ministers who served the congregations nearest to him, his little conference of 5 or 6 clergy around him, kicked him out. He was ejected from the Unitarian fold because he was too radical for his colleagues of the time. And we have inherited both of these strands. I think this strand of desire to be that radical voice that shapes out of our lives, out of our shattering, a vision of justice, and one that would rather play it safe and stay behind what King once called the sanitized stained glass windows. We have a dilemma before us. We have been called by this moment to take risks on behalf of our values. We've been called by this moment to take a stand. I've been walking in my new neighborhood. We haven't quite moved in yet, but I'm taking it in, and one of my neighbors has printed in a giant poster on their wall words updated from that famous passage by the German pastor during World War II. The updated words are, "First they came for the immigrants, and I was not an immigrant, so I did not stand up. Then they came for the journalists, and I was not a journalist, so I did not stand up. Then they came for the trans folks, and I was not trans, so I did not stand up. And of course, when they came for me, there was no one left to stand." You know the words. And so this moment that's going to ask us to take risks. This is a collective process. This is a process in which we will have to work together to figure out what are the right risks, what are the ways that we might put our well-being on the line for a vision of justice that we hold even when the glass shatters, maybe especially when the glass shatters. That moment, Peter assures me that that glass is infinitely recyclable. And so when that glass shatters and falls to the ground, that's the moment when the artist needs to remember their vision, hold it strong enough to get through a hard moment, pick up that glass. You've seen that with the molten at the end, picking up the glass right off the ground, getting it back eventually into the crucible to be forged once more towards a vision. What is it that will keep us with that vision clear of a just society, clear enough that we might take risks? that we might worry more about how we're going to stand up for our values than about the liability or the way it might inconvenience us. It's not easy, but it's something we're going to have to figure out together. One last story. This is a Buddhist tale. It happened after the Buddha was enlightened and was going around to offer his teachings and receive alms from people to survive on. And he comes to the door of a wealthy man to receive his alms. And while the servant goes to get the food to bring it to Buddha, Mara, the Hindu god of death, this destructive force who is furious with Buddha for having relinquished his fear of him, comes and sets the ground before him ablaze. And so when the servant returns with the food to deliver to the Buddha, he finds that the ground before the Buddha is full of hot coals, and he cannot pass. And the servant's scared and goes back to the master of the house, and the master comes out now with the food himself and looks. And this is the question. This is the question before us for this wealthy man in his house at the top of the hill, to look and see the Buddha in need, the Buddha beckoning not just with hunger, but with the gift of a real aliveness, of a vision of how life might be. And before him, this fiery pit of coals. And the story says that somehow, some reason, this man decided to walk across the fire. And then it goes on with a lotus that lifts him up, and he doesn't get burned, he gets carried over. But the point is, he makes the choice, not knowing if he will be burned or not, to risk for something he cares deeply about. May we forge of our lives, each of us, and of our collective life together, heating and cooling, returning to the crucible, shattering after shattering, returning to pursue a vision of justice that leads us onward. May we help to bend that arc of the universe, knowing it will leave shattered glass in its wake. Bend it because our hearts and our souls call us to justice. May it be so, and amen.